Hi. Today I want to ask the question, what if the material was the machine? And this is kind of one instantiation, a small preview that I want to show you of what we mean. And we call this whole concept metamaterial mechanisms, and I want to talk a little bit more extensively about that. Here you see it in action. It's a fully functional door latch that is printed in one piece. So, let's go a little bit back. We fabricate a lot of things these days, and 3D printing is just a stand-in for any other fabrication method at this point. So what is really great to have about having physical objects is that you can, for example, print things for educational purposes. You can print a DNA string and look at it from different perspectives. You can touch it, you can feel it. For mechanical things, you can disassemble them, reassemble them. You can print things that have different material properties that are soft, rough, rigid or flexible. And you can also print things that you can wear, things that are really personalized to you, like this 3D printed cast that is breathable, so there's no itching anymore. But one thing that these three things had in common was that they were actually concerned with the outside of the object. So if we just recap, it was about shape, shape, and shape. Now, here comes the one kicker which actually sets 3D printing apart from other manufacturing techniques. It allows us to arrange matter very freely in space. So then you might ask, what about the inside of the objects, right? And it turns out that researchers in computer graphics, for example, already did it. In this example, they were designing the structure on the inside so that they save material, but the object just remains as strong as it was before. In this case, for example, they left out parts of the inside, just didn't feel it. So this dino with this huge head can actually stand on these teeny tiny feet. So they were actually moving the center of gravity by designing the inside of the object rather than the outside of the object. And here's another example where it's kind of like a similar example, but it's about the rotation. So you can make arbitrary shapes rotate reliably, like this elephant. Now, center of gravity, moment of inertia, these are things that you also learn in school, in physics classes, if you remember. They're known, right? I mean, you can design the inside, that's cool, but that's kind of, it's not exciting, right? But what about if we have this possibility to arrange matter freely in space? Can we engineer for unusual properties, like properties that are just not happening in nature? One example is this one. It looks very easy, kind of just a sheet with a lot of holes, but as you compress it downwards, regular materials would expand in the other direction. But you see that this one is clearly not expanding, right? It's rather contracting in the perpendicular direction to where it was compressed. And this is a really unusual property. Here you see the same concept, but just folded from a piece of paper, so origami folding. And what's really interesting about this is that you see that the person just, moves the hand in one axis, in one dimension, but the sheet actually folds up in 2 dimensions. And that turns out to be really useful for space. So you can package solar panels really small, and then with an easy mechanism, you can unfold it by pulling in one direction, and it unfolds in two dimensions, and that's really useful. So if we go back to this one example that you saw before, I told you that there's just simple circles. It doesn't look very complicated, but no one holds you back in designing these circles to have like any other shape. And then when you compress the whole thing, it kind of you can make it bend in weird directions. And this is a concept that is called mechanical metamaterials, which are artificial structures with mechanical properties defined by their structure rather than their composition. And with composition, they mean the chemical composition, kind of the material it's actually made of, be it wood or plastics or metal. It's really about the structures. So far, metamaterials have been understood as materials. But what if we think of them as machines? And this is exactly the instantiation that I showed you in the very beginning as a small preview. We think of these materials where we design the structure. At the same time, they're not materials, they're machines. So if we walk through this example real quick, you see that the user is pushing down the handle, and that creates a rotation around the axis down there next to the handle. And this, in turn, lets the shearing cells in the middle shear, and they then pull in the bolt that lets you open the door. Now let's just quickly review a traditional door latch. So again, you push down the handle, that creates a rotation around the axle, which charges the handle spring, which is behind that thing, and at the same time rotates the lever, which then pulls in the bolt and charges the latch spring. So you see, there are a lot of parts involved here. I counted them for you. It's 6 in this case. And I also counted the one that we proposed, and that's one part. So you see, one main benefit is that it requires no assembly. So you can actually give it out to users, and they just take it out of the printer, and it works really nicely. And one more thing that excites me about this concept is that me as a computer scientist, we can actually, the function is solely defined by the geometry, so that, and the computers are pretty good at processing geometry and stuff. So what you see here is actually a 3D editor that we built for allowing users to design such mechanisms. And the editor is online. We published it on GitHub for anyone who wants to program further. There's the source code, and also we uploaded all the models that we printed, and I will show you on Thingiverse. So I want to give you now a little bit more detail of how this thing actually works and what type of cells we use. So to do that, I use a simpler example, which is these pliers here. So you see they work like this. As you press it, they go down to, they move towards each other. And what you see here is that we partitioned this thing into a regular grid of cells. And all the cells can look like this. And the rigid cells, we just use the square thing, the square with the diagonal, and that results in a triangle, which is a very stable structure, so it doesn't move in any way. And with these cells, you can make up for the rigid parts of the object. Now the other thing, the more interesting cells are the so-called shearing cells, and they're even simpler, so you just leave out the one diagonal. So that means that they can actually move now, and they move in a very controlled direction, so they only shear. And having multiple of those gives us the whole area that we need for this mechanism. Now, because we have nothing to assemble, like everything is based on bending. And this is actually based on an idea from industry, which is called living hinge. So you make things from one part, and this hinge here is just that you make the material thinner, and that allows it to flex. And this is actually used in industry quite a bit. For example, these things, or bottle caps, tic-tac packaging, I'm sure you've seen them already. So if we simply based all the mechanisms, the first naive approach on the idea of having living hinges, then it would look something like this. So you have like the cells, and then you make like a thin part of the material so it's able to move, and it would look like this. But the problem is, because you have so little material there, it would be very weak and just tear. So what we actually set out is that we use these shearing cells, and we kind of replicate many of these small living hinges so that the object is able to take more force. And this is what we call a hinge array. And the thing is that the whole array moves as one. Now, if you enclose this hinge array within rigid parts, then you get something that has the property that the opposing members stay parallel. And if we look at this example, it is actually already the pliers. So they move together as you move the other parts together. And it looks like this. So you just give the members different geometry to make up for the handles and the brackets. And essentially, this is a hinge. It's pliers, but just made from one part, no axle. Now, if you take multiple of these hinge arrays and just like chain them up, you can get something that's actually pretty surprising. So this is a thing that replicates your drawing, but it's just like one piece of material. And if you do more complicated things with multiple layers and so on, you kind of get this walking robot that is just made in one piece. This is the rendition of the Jansen walker, which is also known as Strand Beast, maybe to some of you. Okay, but let's go in a little bit deeper so we actually understand what's going on here. Because there's not always just benefits, but also limitations to a system. So in this case, you see that the user actually puts in some force into the system, into the door latch. And then as the handle rotates, it pushes the cells next to it, they push the cell next to them, and they push the cell next to them, and so forth. However, at every step, at every transition from one cell to the other, you lose some energy. So that means that the force that was put in by the user when he pushed down the handle is not the same that goes into the bolt that is pulled in, which is fine for this example. But we were kind of thinking, as computer scientists, what about digital signals? Something that behaves like domino, You put many of them in a row, and if they're aligned properly, they can go on and on and on. There's no energy decay. So we actually set out and created some of these digital metamaterials. And these cells look slightly more complicated than the ones I showed you before, and they embed a spring. And that one stores energy. And I will just show you, this is called a bistable spring. So it's the concept of, for example, if you have a credit card, you push your fingers together, and it's happy in this position, but if you push it over, it's also happy in this position. And because it's bent, it stores some energy. And it needs a slight push, and it jumps over to the other state on its own. And this is kind of what we did here with these slightly more complicated springs. So you push them from the side, and then the one cell jumps over to its other state, pushes the next cell, that jumps over to its other state, pushes the next cell, and so on. And every time it jumps over, it releases energy, its own energy that it has stored. And because every cell stores its own energy, there's no decay. So the output could be somewhere over there. And because you can see every cell as like a tiny battery, if you so will. It kind of releases like this. Now, what we did with this is, for example, you see this black door latch. It's the same thing that you just saw in pink. But we added a door lock where you enter digits, and the computation is also done based on the material that we added. So again, everything is integrated into the cell structure of the object. And here I just want to give you a quick overview. This is the signal transmission, so we can transmit signals as I just showed you. We can route signals differently around the corner. This is very important. We can validate signals, so we can block signals, because otherwise if the code would be wrong that you input, it would always open. This is not desirable. But we can actually evaluate if that is correct, the code that you entered. And then we can also duplicate signals and make them move more. So in conclusion, the one take-home message that I wanted to share with you is that we actually think of materials, of metamaterials, being machines rather than just materials. And the idea is that you see this pink thing here, you could think that's the mechanism, but if you go on and make this whole door, you print the whole door with the mechanism, just with these cells. You just use rigid cells that you also use in the handle and in the bolt. So the question is, where does the material start and where does the mechanism start? We think that they become indistinguishable from each other. And I just showed you this at hand of two examples. So it's materials that actually incorporate, they embed mechanical functions. And I showed you this other example where materials actually embed computational functions. And this is what I think of being a new perspective on smart matter. So you give the materials more wisdom in a way that they can be mechanisms, they can be small computers, but they don't need electronics, and it's only done on the level of having the material structure that resolves all of that for you. With this, I was talking in the we form. We as researchers always say we because you always have help, and I want to thank all of these people who helped and advised me on these projects. And under this link, you find all the sources that I mentioned, the Thingiverse and the code. And with this, I want to thank you.